Listen carefully, because what you're about to hear is not speculation. It's a rapidly evolving situation that could reshape global power dynamics in real time. The Strait of Hormuz, one of the most critical choke points in the global economy, is now under extreme pressure. This narrow waterway, through which roughly a fifth of the world's oil supply flows, is no longer operating under normal conditions. Shipping traffic has slowed dramatically. Some vessels are rerouting, others are holding position, waiting for clarity that hasn't come. Insurance premiums are surging, risk assessments are being rewritten by the hour, and energy markets are reacting with volatility that reflects one thing: uncertainty. And uncertainty in a place like Hormuz is as powerful as control. Over the past days, we've seen a sharp escalation. The United States and Israel have deployed significant military assets, carrier groups, advanced aircraft, missile defense systems designed for dominance in conventional warfare environments. But what they're facing here is not conventional. Iran is not trying to match power with power. It is applying a different model entirely, one built on geography, preparation, and asymmetric pressure. Instead of large fleet engagements, we're seeing layered tactics: fast attack craft operating in groups, mobile missile systems along the coastline, drones used not necessarily to destroy but to overwhelm, distract, and exhaust defensive systems. Naval mines, whether confirmed or suspected, introduce another dimension. They don't need to sink ships to be effective. The mere possibility forces hesitation, slows movement, and complicates every operational decision. This is how a choke point becomes contested, not necessarily by closing it outright, but by making every passage through it a calculated risk. And that distinction matters, because control doesn't always look like domination. Sometimes it looks like denial, denying safety, denying predictability, denying confidence. That's what we're seeing emerge. Now, let's talk about what's actually happening on the military level. Reports indicate waves of drone activity, missile launches, and naval maneuvers. Some claims are exaggerated, some remain unverified, but the pattern is clear. Pressure is being applied from multiple directions, forcing U.S. and allied forces to operate defensively in an environment where they typically dictate the terms. And that shift, subtle but real, is strategically significant, because modern naval power is optimized for open environments where detection ranges are long, response times are manageable, and threats are more easily isolated. The Strait of Hormuz is the opposite. It's narrow, it's congested, it's geographically constrained. And in that environment, even low-cost systems, if used in volume and coordination, can create disproportionate effects. This is the essence of asymmetric warfare. It's not about winning through superior firepower. It's about changing the rules of engagement. Now look at the economic side. Even without a full shutdown, disruptions here ripple globally. A partial reduction in flow, increased insurance costs, delays in transit, all of these factors compound quickly. Markets don't wait for confirmation, they react to risk. And right now, risk is rising. But here's where we need to stay grounded. There is no confirmed total takeover of the strait. There is no verified collapse of U.S. naval capability. And there is no clear indication that control has permanently shifted to any one side. What we are seeing is something more complex and arguably more important. A contested environment where traditional dominance is being challenged, where smaller systems are forcing larger powers to adapt, and where the outcome is not determined by who has the most advanced technology, but by who can operate more effectively under constrained conditions. That's the real story. And it leads to the bigger question: what happens next? Does the United States escalate further, committing more assets, taking greater risks to reassert control, or does it adapt, shifting towards standoff strategies, air power, and indirect pressure rather than direct presence inside the strait? And on the other side, how far is Iran willing to push? Because there's a line between pressure and full closure, and crossing it would trigger consequences that extend far beyond the region. This moment is not just about a waterway. It's about the limits of military power in constrained environments. It's about how modern warfare is evolving, and it's about whether long-standing assumptions about control, deterrence, and dominance still hold under pressure. Stay with me, because in the next part, we're going to break down the specific tactics and systems being used and why they are forcing even the most advanced militaries in the world to rethink how they operate in places like this. Ended everything but a phase where the balance began to shift in a visible way. Multiple reports point to a coordinated escalation in early March, an operation that, whether officially named or not, reflected months, if not years, of preparation. What made this moment different was not just the scale, but the synchronization. Iran did not rely on one system, it activated multiple layers at once. Fast attack craft began operating in larger coordinated groups, emerging from coastal positions and nearby islands. At the same time, missile activity intensified. Both cruise and ballistic systems launched from mobile platforms that were difficult to track and target in real time. Drone operations increased in volume as well, not necessarily to destroy high-value targets outright, but to complicate the defensive picture, to force tracking systems to process more inputs than they were designed for simultaneously. And alongside all of this, the persistent threat, confirmed or suspected, of naval mines began shaping behavior in the shipping lanes. Individually, none of these elements are decisive. Together, they create pressure, and that pressure accumulates. For naval forces operating in the Strait, the challenge is not simply interception, it's management. Managing limited defensive resources, managing reaction time, managing uncertainty in a confined and cluttered environment. Even highly advanced systems like Aegis are built around assumptions about detection range, engagement timelines, and the number of simultaneous threats they are expected to handle. When those assumptions are stretched, performance doesn't collapse, but it becomes strained, and that's where the shift begins. Reports of ships maneuvering out of the narrowest parts of the strait or repositioning to reduce exposure suggest not defeat but adaptation. However, adaptation has consequences, because once naval forces operate at greater distance, their ability to guarantee secure passage for commercial shipping becomes more limited. And that's the key point. This was not about destroying a fleet or achieving total battlefield dominance in a single night. It was about altering the conditions of control, turning a previously manageable environment into a contested one, turning confidence into caution, turning routine operations into calculated risk. From that point forward, the dynamics change. Shipping companies begin to hesitate, insurance premiums surge, transit slows, some routes are abandoned altogether. The strait doesn't need to be physically closed to be strategically disrupted. Now, looking at the response, the United States has deployed significant naval and air assets into the broader region. Carrier strike groups provide reach, flexibility, and deterrence. Air power allows for sustained operations without requiring constant presence inside the most constrained areas of the strait. But even with that capability, there are limits. Airstrikes can target infrastructure, launch sites, and support systems, but mobile assets are inherently difficult to eliminate completely. They move, they disperse, and they reappear. This creates a cycle: strike, degrade, adapt, re-emerge. Israel's involvement follows a similar pattern. Precision strikes can impose costs, but they do not necessarily translate into immediate control over maritime space, especially when the operational challenge is distributed and constantly shifting. And then there's the regional dimension. Gulf states are cautious. Public alignment with any escalation carries risk, particularly when their own infrastructure lies within range of retaliation. European involvement remains limited, reflecting both capability constraints and political hesitation. So the idea of a unified, large-scale coalition response remains more theoretical than operational. Now, bringing in the broader geopolitical layer, Russia and China are not directly engaged militarily, but their roles are still relevant. Russia's experience with electronic warfare and missile systems has long been studied, and any technical cooperation, real or perceived, feeds into assessments of Iranian capability. China, meanwhile, operates on the economic axis. Continued energy purchases, trade channels, and diplomatic positioning help sustain resilience over time. Neither country needs to intervene directly to influence the balance. Their involvement is measured, indirect, and strategic, and that's what makes it effective. So what are we actually witnessing here? Not a sudden collapse of one side, not a decisive final victory by the other, but a transformation of the operating environment. A demonstration that in confined maritime spaces, advanced naval power does not automatically translate into uncontested control, that cost, scale, and doctrine can be offset by geography, preparation, and volume, and that once a choke point becomes contested at this level, restoring full control is not a matter of hours or days, it becomes a complex, ongoing challenge. Which brings us to the real turning point, not the moment missiles were launched, but the moment the strait stopped being predictable. Because in global strategy, predictability is power, and right now that power is being tested. The external support from Moscow and Beijing has clearly influenced the strategic environment, but it's important to understand what that support actually looks like. It is not a formal military alliance in the traditional sense. There are no large-scale deployments, no direct battlefield coordination in the open. Instead, the support is indirect, calibrated, and carefully managed. Russia brings experience, particularly in areas like electronic warfare, missile systems, and operating under sustained pressure. Even limited technical cooperation or intelligence sharing can have an outsized impact in a conflict defined by precision and timing. China operates on a different axis altogether. Its role is primarily economic and diplomatic, maintaining trade flows, absorbing energy exports, and signaling that Iran is not isolated from the global system. That alone reduces the effectiveness of long-term pressure strategies. Together, these forms of support don't decide the conflict, but they shape its resilience. They make it harder to isolate, harder to degrade, and harder to resolve quickly. But even that doesn't fully explain what we're seeing. Because beyond weapons, beyond tactics, beyond external backing, there is another factor that consistently appears in conflicts like this: internal cohesion. Iran has over decades developed a system that is built to absorb pressure. Sanctions, cyber operations, targeted strikes, none of these are new variables. They are part of an environment the country has been adapting to for years. That doesn't mean it is unaffected. It means it is conditioned, and that conditioning matters in conflict. Because wars are not only fought with platforms and systems, they are also shaped by how societies respond under stress, how quickly they fragment, or how strongly they consolidate. In Iran's case, external pressure has often had a unifying effect, at least in the short term. Moments of crisis tend to reinforce narratives of sovereignty and resistance, which in turn sustain operational continuity even under difficult conditions. But it's important to avoid oversimplifying this. No country operates with a single mindset. Public opinion is complex. Economic strain, political divisions, and long-term fatigue all exist beneath the surface. The same is true on the other side. Morale, purpose, and perception vary widely within any military force. So framing one side as purely driven by conviction and the other as lacking it doesn't capture reality. What is more accurate is this: different actors are operating with different motivations. For Iran, the conflict is geographically immediate and directly tied to national security. For the United States and its allies, it is part of a broader strategic framework linked to stability, deterrence, and global economic flows. Those differences influence decision-making, they influence risk tolerance, and they influence how long each side is willing or able to sustain pressure. What we are seeing, then, is not simply a clash of weapons or alliances, it is a clash of approaches. A technologically advanced, globally deployed military structure encountering a localized, adaptive system designed specifically for this environment. And when those two models meet in a constrained space like the Strait of Hormuz, the outcome is not always determined by who has the more advanced hardware. It is determined by who can operate more effectively under the specific conditions of that environment. Now, stepping back to the larger picture, what is unfolding in Hormuz is not by itself the end of any global order, but it is a stress test, a test of assumptions that have shaped international security for decades about freedom of navigation, about the reliability of power projection, and about the ability of major powers to control critical choke points. If those assumptions begin to weaken even slightly, the effects ripple outward. Other regions take notice. Other actors reassess. Strategies evolve. That is how broader shifts begin, not with a single decisive moment, but with a series of events that gradually reshape expectations. And that's what makes this situation so significant, because regardless of how it resolves, it is already influencing how modern conflict is understood. For decades, the United States has operated as the primary guarantor of maritime security, projecting naval power across key trade routes and energy corridors. That position hasn't disappeared, but in places like the Strait of Hormuz, it is being tested in ways that are difficult to ignore. What we are seeing now is not the sudden collapse of one system or the immediate rise of another. It is something more subtle and potentially more significant, a shift from uncontested control to contested space. In Hormuz, that shift is visible. A narrow waterway that once functioned with relative predictability is now operating under conditions of risk, uncertainty, and constant recalculation. Commercial shipping is more cautious, insurance costs are rising, military forces are adapting their posture, control in the traditional sense has become harder to define, and that matters. Because global power is not just measured by capability, it is measured by the ability to maintain stable conditions in critical regions. When stability erodes, even partially, it forces a reassessment of assumptions that have been in place for decades. Now, stepping back to the broader geopolitical picture, there is increasing coordination among countries like Iran, Russia, and China, but it's important to understand what that coordination is and what it is not. It is not a formal alliance with unified command structures. It is not a single bloc acting with one voice. Instead, it is a convergence of interests. Russia brings strategic experience and political leverage in international forums. China provides economic depth and alternative trade pathways. Iran operates on the front line of this specific regional dynamic. Each plays a different role, and together they create friction against a system that was once dominated by a single center of power. But friction is not the same as replacement. The global system is not flipping overnight from one pole to another. What we are seeing is a gradual transition, messy, uneven, and contested toward a more distributed balance of power. At the same time, the Western alliance is not disappearing. The United States still maintains unmatched global reach. Its Navy remains one of the most capable forces ever assembled. Its alliances still carry significant weight, militarily, economically, and diplomatically. But capability alone does not guarantee outcome in every environment. And that's the key lesson emerging from Hormuz. In confined, high-pressure spaces where geography limits maneuverability and adversaries are prepared to exploit those limits, even the most advanced forces face constraints. That does not mean they are defeated. It means they must adapt. Now consider how the rest of the world is interpreting this moment. Countries across the global south are watching closely, not necessarily to choose sides, but to understand what is possible. They are observing how power is applied, how resistance works, and how quickly the strategic picture can shift under pressure. And that observation alone begins to influence future decisions, because perception shapes alignment. If the perception of uncontested dominance weakens even slightly, it opens space for new calculations, new partnerships, and new strategies. That's how global shifts begin, not with a single decisive victory, but with a series of moments that challenge what was once assumed to be permanent. So what does all of this mean going forward? The situation in the Strait of Hormuz remains fluid. It could escalate further, it could stabilize through negotiation, or it could settle into a prolonged period of tension where neither side fully controls the environment but both shape it. What's clear is this: the assumptions that defined the last few decades are under pressure. The ability to guarantee security in critical choke points is no longer taken for granted, and the structure of global power is becoming more complex, not less. So the real question isn't whether one side has won or lost. The real question is how each actor adapts to this new reality and what that adaptation will look like in the next phase. Because this story is not ending here, it's just entering a new chapter.